The guns were aimed at the house. Torches surrounded them on all sides. Danny was crying in Rose's arms. Wyatt was bleeding, and Pierce's voice cut through the darkness like a blade. "Send out the woman or I burn you all alive." Grace stood. "Don't!" Wyatt shouted, but she was already walking toward the door, hands raised. "I'm here, Pierce. Let them go. I'll leave with you. Just don't hurt them." She pulled free from Wyatt's grip and stepped into the firelight alone, unarmed, ready to sacrifice everything for the people she loved. Then Marshal Brennan's voice rang out, "Randall Pierce, you're under arrest." But you're wondering how a woman covered in dust and blood standing in the middle of a Texas street while stones flew at her face ended up here, standing between a desperate rancher and a powerful man who would stop at nothing to destroy her. This is that story. The stone hit Grace Whitmore square in the forehead, and blood began to trickle down her face in a thin crimson line. She didn't flinch, didn't cry out, didn't run. She stood in the middle of Main Street in Broken Creek, Texas, on a sweltering July afternoon in 1874, surrounded by a mob of 20 righteous citizens who had decided she was not one of them. "Get out of our town, whore!" A woman in her 40s, dressed in a respectable calico dress, hurled the words with more venom than the stone itself. Grace wiped the blood from her eyebrow with the back of her hand. Her clothes were torn and dust-covered from 3 days of walking. Her shoes had holes in the soles. She had exactly $3 to her name and nowhere in the world to go. But she would not beg. She had learned that begging only made people crueler. "I'm not what you think I am," Grace said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her legs. "But I won't beg you to believe me." Another stone flew through the air. This time she saw it coming and moved her head just enough. The rock whistled past her ear and clattered on the wooden boardwalk behind her. "Leave now, or we'll make you leave." A man's voice, deep and threatening, came from the back of the crowd. Grace turned slowly, meeting the eyes of each person who stared at her with such hatred. Women clutched their children close as if Grace carried some contagion. Men fingered their belts and gun holsters. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dirt street into a furnace. She had walked 80 miles from San Antonio to reach this place. 80 miles through heat and dust and fear, sleeping in ditches, drinking from streams, rationing the small amount of bread and cheese she'd been able to afford. Broken Creek was supposed to be different, small enough that her reputation might not have reached it, remote enough that she might find work and start over. She had been wrong. "You have until sunset," the man said. "After that, we won't be responsible for what happens." Grace nodded once, then turned her back on the mob. It took every ounce of strength she possessed to walk away slowly with her head up and her shoulders back. Not running, never running. Each step felt like she was wading through deep water, her muscles screaming for her to collapse. She didn't know that in the crowd standing near the back, where the shade of the general store's awning provided relief from the brutal sun, a man was watching. A man whose eyes were the color of a winter sky, cold and distant but seeing everything. A man who had witnessed enough injustice in his 34 years to recognize it when it stood bleeding in the middle of a street. A man who was about to make a choice that would change the course of 3 lives forever. Wyatt Morgan stood motionless as the crowd dispersed, people returning to their shops and homes with satisfied expressions, as if they had just completed an unpleasant but necessary chore. He had come to town for supplies, simple things like coffee and nails and rope. He hadn't expected to see a woman stoned like it was biblical times. The memory came unbidden, sharp as a knife. Sarah, 8 months pregnant with Danny, standing in almost this exact spot 6 years ago while women whispered behind their hands. His wife had married a Yankee, a man who fought for the Union, and that had been enough to make her suspect in some eyes. She had endured it with grace, but Wyatt remembered the tears she cried at night when she thought he was asleep. Wyatt. Caleb Reed, his ranch foreman and oldest friend, touched his elbow. "We should get the supplies and head back." Wyatt didn't move. His eyes followed the woman as she disappeared around the corner of the livery stable, heading toward the creek that ran along the eastern edge of town. She was moving like someone who had been walking for days, each step a victory over exhaustion. Wyatt? Caleb's voice held a note of concern. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about what Sarah would want me to do. Caleb sighed. He had known Wyatt Morgan for 15 years since they'd served together in the war. He recognized that tone. It meant Wyatt's mind was already made up and nothing would change it. That woman's got scandal following her like a shadow. Folks say she was involved with a married man back in San Antonio, that she destroyed a family. Wyatt finally looked at his friend. Do you believe everything folks say? I believe where there's smoke, there's usually fire. And I believe that people throw stones when they're looking for someone weaker to blame for their own miseries. Wyatt turned and began walking toward the mercantile. Get the supplies. I'll meet you back here in an hour. Where are you going? Wyatt didn't answer. He was already moving down the street, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust, his hat pulled low against the sun. He walked past the church where Reverend Cole was no doubt inside preparing his Sunday sermon about sin and redemption. He walked past the saloon where men drank away their wages and their worries. He walked until he reached the path that led down to the creek. The creek was one of the few reliable water sources in this part of Texas, fed by a spring that never seemed to run dry even in the worst droughts. Trees lined its banks, providing blessed shade, and the water ran clear over smooth stones. Wyatt found the woman kneeling at the water's edge, washing blood from her face and hands. She must have heard his approach because she stood quickly, her hand moving to her pocket where he glimpsed the handle of a small knife. Her eyes, he noticed, were gray like storm clouds. They held no tears, only a fierce determination that reminded him of wounded animals who refused to show weakness to predators. I'm leaving, she said before he could speak. You don't need to threaten me. I'll be gone before sunset. I didn't come to threaten you. She didn't lower her guard. Then why did you come? To make you an offer. A bitter smile crossed her face. I've heard offers before, mister. They all come with strings attached. Wyatt understood her suspicion. A woman alone, desperate with nowhere to go. She'd be right to expect the worst from any man who approached her. He took off his hat partly out of respect and partly so she could see his face clearly. I need a housekeeper, someone to cook, clean, help manage my household and care for my son. Pay is $20 a month plus room and board. 3 meals a day, your own room with a lock on the door. She stared at him as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. Why me? Because you need work. I need help. Seems straightforward. Nothing's straightforward, mister. Morgan. Wyatt Morgan. Nothing's straightforward, Mr. Morgan. What's the catch? What do you really want? The question was fair. Wyatt considered his answer carefully. He could tell her about Danny, about how his 7-year-old son hadn't spoken a word in 2 years, how the boy sat in his room clutching a wooden horse his mother had carved for him, staring at nothing, how Rosa, the housekeeper who had been with the family for 20 years, was getting too old to manage everything alone, how the house that had once been full of life and laughter now felt like a tomb. But none of that was this woman's burden to carry. I want someone who'll work hard, he said simply. Who'll do the job they're paid to do. I don't care about your past. I care about whether you can cook a decent meal and keep a house clean. And if the town comes after me, if they demand you send me away? Wyatt's expression didn't change, but something cold and hard entered his eyes. My ranch. My rules. Nobody tells me what to do on my own land. The woman studied him for a long moment. He could see her calculating, weighing her options. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. If I say yes and you try anything, anything at all, I'll cut you in your sleep and take my chances with the law. Fair enough. And I want that promise in writing. $20 a month, room and board, my own room with a lock. You can read and write. I was a teacher, Mr. Morgan. Before... She stopped, pressing her lips together. Before whatever happened, Wyatt finished. We can draw up papers if it makes you feel safer. My foreman's waiting at the mercantile. He'll witness the agreement. She looked down at her hands, at the raw blisters and dirt under her nails, looked up at the sun already beginning its descent toward the western horizon, looked back at him, at this stranger who claimed to want nothing but honest work. Yes, she said finally. I'll take the job. What's your name? Grace. Grace Whitmore. Well then, Miss Whitmore, let's get you home. The ride to Morgan Valley Ranch took just under an hour. Grace sat behind Wyatt on his horse, a powerful bay mare that handled the extra weight without complaint. She kept her hands lightly on his waist, maintaining as much distance as possible while staying secure in the saddle. Caleb Reed rode alongside them on a sorrel gelding, his expression clearly dubious, but his mouth wisely shut. They rode south from town, following a well-worn trail that cut through scrubland dotted with mesquite and live oak. The land here was tough, unforgiving, beautiful in its harshness. Grace had grown up in San Antonio, a city girl who knew books and music and proper manners. The frontier was still new to her, still intimidating with its vast open spaces and endless sky. "How long have you owned the ranch?" she asked, more to fill the silence than out of genuine curiosity. "Bought the land 12 years ago before the war. Built the house after I got back. My wife, Sarah." He paused. She picked the spot, said it was the most beautiful place she'd ever seen. Grace heard the past tense, heard the weight of grief in those simple words. She knew better than to ask what had happened. Grief was not something people spoke of lightly in this country. It was carried quietly like stones in a pocket, growing heavier with each passing day. They crested a low hill, and suddenly the ranch spread out before them. Grace caught her breath. A creek, the same one that ran through town but wider here, wound through a valley of green grass. Cattle, maybe 200 head, grazed peacefully in the afternoon sun. A barn and several outbuildings sat to the left, all well maintained. And in the center, surrounded by a white fence that had seen better days but was still standing proud, a 2-story house made of solid timber with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. It was the kind of house that should have been filled with children's laughter and the warm glow of lamplight in the evenings. But even from a distance, Grace could sense the emptiness. No smoke from the chimney despite the approaching dinner hour. No curtains in the windows moving with life inside. No dogs running to greet their returning master. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Sarah thought so too. Wyatt urged the horse forward down the slope toward the ranch. As they drew closer, the front door opened and a woman emerged onto the porch. She was older, perhaps 60, with gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and the weathered face of someone who had spent a lifetime working under the sun. She wore a simple cotton dress and an apron, and her dark eyes were sharp as she watched them approach. "Wyatt!" she called out, her accent carrying the musical lilt of northern Mexico. "Who is this?" "New housekeeper Rosa. This is Miss Grace Whitmore." Rosa's eyes narrowed as she took in Grace's bedraggled appearance, the dried blood still visible on her forehead, the torn hem of her dress. "We don't need another housekeeper." "Yes, we do." Wyatt dismounted and helped Grace down. His hands on her waist were gentle but impersonal. "Danny needs more attention than you can give him alone, and you've been complaining about the washing and the cooking for months." "That's because you eat like 3 men." Rosa shot back, but there was affection in her tone. She turned her attention to Grace. "You have experience keeping house." "Yes, ma'am. I can cook, clean, sew, and manage household accounts. I also have some medical training. My mother was a nurse." Rosa's expression softened slightly at the respectful "ma'am." "Come inside. You look like death walking. When did you last eat?" "Yesterday morning." "Madre de Dios." Rosa shook her head and gestured toward the house. "Come, I'll feed you, then we'll see about that cut on your head." Wyatt watched the 2 women disappear into the house, then turned to Caleb, who had been unusually silent. "Say it," Wyatt told him. "Say what?" "Whatever you're thinking. I can see it written all over your face." Caleb dismounted and began loosening his horse's girth. "I'm thinking you just brought home a woman with a scandal following her. A woman the whole town wants gone. And I'm thinking that's going to bring you nothing but trouble." "Maybe." "Not maybe. Definitely." Caleb pulled off his hat and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Look, Wyatt, I know you're trying to help. I know you see Sarah in every woman who gets treated badly by this town. But have you thought about what this means for Danny? For the ranch? For your standing with the community?" Wyatt's jaw tightened. "I stopped caring about my standing with the community when they whispered about Sarah at her own funeral. when they said maybe it was God's punishment for marrying a Yankee, when not one of them offered to help with Danny afterward. That was 3 years ago. People have short memories. They've mostly moved on. Then they can keep moving. I make my decisions based on what's right, not on what's convenient. Caleb sighed. He knew that tone. At least tell me you have a plan if this goes sideways. The plan is simple. She works. She earns her keep. If anyone has a problem with it, they can take it up with me directly. And when Pierce finds out? The mention of Randall Pierce made Wyatt's expression turn cold. Pierce owned the largest spread in 3 counties, the Pierce Cattle Company, which sprawled across 2,500 acres to the west. He had been trying to buy Wyatt's land for 2 years, making increasingly aggressive offers. The last one had come with a thinly veiled threat about what happened to people who didn't cooperate with their neighbors. Pierce doesn't dictate what happens on my land. He might think differently. Then he and I will have a conversation about boundaries. Wyatt picked up his saddlebags. Take care of the horses. I need to check on Danny. Inside the house, Grace stood in the kitchen while Rosa pressed a damp cloth to her forehead. The kitchen was large and well equipped with a cast-iron stove that dominated one wall, open shelving filled with dishes and pots, and a long wooden table that could seat 8 people comfortably. Hold still, Rosa commanded, dabbing at the cut. It's not deep. You won't need stitches. Thank you, Grace said quietly. Rosa grunted, continuing her work. After a moment she spoke again, her voice softer. Why did they do this to you? What did you do? I refused the wrong man. Grace met Rosa's eyes, and he made sure I paid for it. Something in Grace's face must have convinced Rosa of her sincerity, because the older woman nodded slowly. I know that story. Too many women know that story. She finished cleaning the wound and stepped back. The cut will heal. But the other wounds, she touched her chest over her heart, those take longer. Grace felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. Kindness after so much cruelty was almost harder to bear than the stones. Now eat. Rosa placed a bowl of stew in front of her, still warm from the lunch meal. Then I'll show you your room. Tomorrow we'll discuss your duties. The stew was rich with beef and vegetables, seasoned with something Grace didn't recognize but tasted wonderful. She forced herself to eat slowly, though her stomach screamed for her to devour everything in front of her. She had learned the hard way that eating too quickly after days of near starvation led to painful cramps. As she ate, she heard footsteps on the stairs, heavy boots moving slowly accompanied by lighter steps. Wyatt appeared in the kitchen doorway, and behind him, clinging to his hand, was a boy. Grace's first thought was how much the child looked like his mother must have looked. He had Wyatt's height for his age, but everything else spoke of softer genetics. Brown hair that fell over his forehead in waves, large brown eyes that seemed too solemn for such a young face, a delicate bone structure that would probably make him handsome when he grew into it. Danny, this is Miss Grace, Wyatt said gently. She's going to be helping Rosa take care of the house. The boy didn't respond, didn't look at Grace. His eyes remained fixed on the wooden floor, and his grip on his father's hand tightened. Can you say hello? Wyatt prompted, though his tone suggested he didn't expect an answer. Silence. Grace set down her spoon and smiled, though she kept her voice calm and non-threatening. Hello, Danny. That's a fine horse you're holding. The boy clutched a small wooden horse tighter to his chest. It was beautifully carved, every detail lovingly rendered. Someone had put hours of work into making it. His mother made that, Rosa said quietly. She was good with her hands. Grace nodded, understanding flooding through her. The boy's silence, the grief that hung over this house like fog, the emptiness in Wyatt's eyes. They were all mourning, each in their own way, unable or unwilling to move forward. I had a horse like that when I was young, Grace said, still speaking gently to Danny, though he wouldn't look at her. Mine was white with a black mane. I named him Thunder because I pretended he could run so fast he made thunder with his hooves. Still no response. But Grace noticed that Danny's grip on the wooden horse had relaxed slightly. "What's your horse's name?" she asked. "Nothing." The boy might as well have been carved from wood himself. Wyatt's expression was painful to witness. Hope and disappointment warred on his face before he carefully smoothed it back to neutral. "Come on, son. Let's get you back upstairs." After they left, Grace looked at Rosa. "How long?" 2 years. Not a word. Not a sound. Doctors say there's nothing physically wrong with him. They say it's—" She tapped her temple. "Up here. The grief broke something. His mother died giving birth to his sister. The baby died too." Rosa crossed herself. 2 years, 3 months, and 5 days ago. Danny was 5 years old. He watched his mother struggle for 3 days before the fever took her. Since then, nothing. Grace felt her heart break for the silent boy upstairs. She knew about loss, about trauma, about how the mind sometimes protected itself by shutting down. But she also knew about resilience, about the human capacity to heal given time and patience and love. "May I take him dinner tonight?" she asked. "In his room." Rosa looked at her with something between surprise and approval. "Most people avoid him, say it's unnerving a child who doesn't speak. Most people are fools." Rosa's weathered face broke into the first genuine smile Grace had seen from her. "You might do after all, mija. You might do." That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple, Grace carried a tray upstairs. Danny's room was at the end of the hallway door, slightly ajar. She knocked softly, waiting for an invitation that she knew wouldn't come, then entered anyway. The room was neat, but sparse. A small bed with a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers with a few books stacked on top, a window that overlooked the creek. And in the corner, sitting on the floor with his knees pulled to his chest and that wooden horse clutched in his hands, Danny. "I brought dinner," Grace said, keeping her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "Rosa made chicken and dumplings. It's quite good." She set the tray on the chest of drawers and sat down on the floor far enough away that she wouldn't crowd the boy close enough that her presence was unmistakable. She didn't speak again, didn't try to force conversation or interaction. She simply sat breathing quietly, letting him grow accustomed to her. After 10 minutes, she stood, picked up the tray, and placed it on the floor within his reach. "I'll come back in an hour to collect the dishes. You don't have to eat if you don't want to, but it's here if you do." She left, closing the door softly behind her. Downstairs, she found Wyatt on the front porch, sitting in a rocking chair that looked handmade, staring out at his land as darkness crept across the valley. Grace hesitated, then stepped outside. "May I join you?" He gestured to another chair. "It's your home now, too." They sat in silence for a while, listening to the night sounds. Crickets singing, a lone coyote howling in the distance, the soft lowing of cattle settling down for the night. "I won't give up on him," Grace said finally. "Your son. I won't give up." Wyatt turned to look at her, his face half in shadow. "Doctors say he might never speak again." "Doctors don't know everything." "You can't fix him, Miss Whitmore. I've tried. Rosa's tried. Nothing works." "Maybe he doesn't need fixing. Maybe he just needs someone to listen to his silence." Grace met his eyes. "I know what it's like to have words taken from you, to have your voice stolen by people who decided they knew your story better than you did." Something shifted in Wyatt's expression. Understanding, perhaps, recognition that this woman was not just another hired hand but someone who carried her own wounds. "The town will come," he said, "probably tomorrow or the next day. They'll demand I send you away." "And will you?" "No." The certainty in that single syllable made Grace's chest tighten. "You don't know me, Mr. Morgan. You have no reason to defend me." "I know enough." He returned his gaze to the darkening land. "I know you walked 80 miles to get here. I know you stood in that street today and took their judgment without breaking. I know you're the first person who's looked at Danny as a child instead of a problem to be solved. That's all I need to know." Grace felt something dangerous stirring in her chest. Hope. After 6 months of despair, after losing everything, after being cast out and condemned, this stranger was offering her something she thought she'd never have again. A chance. "Thank you," she whispered. "Don't thank me yet. Tomorrow the work starts, and it won't be easy. I'm not afraid of hard work." "Good, because sunrise comes early on a ranch." Grace smiled for the first time in months. "Then I'd better get some sleep." She stood and headed for the door, then paused. "Mr. Morgan." "Yes." "Your wife. She must have been an extraordinary woman." Wyatt's voice was rough when he answered. "She was." "Then I'll try to honor her memory by taking care of the people she loved." After Grace went inside, Wyatt sat alone on the porch for another hour, wrestling with the decision he'd made. Caleb was right. Bringing Grace here would cause trouble. The town would push back. And if he wasn't careful, his attempts to help her might end up destroying them both. But he kept seeing that moment in the street, the woman standing tall while stones flew, the dignity in her bearing even covered in dust and blood. The way she had spoken to Danny with genuine interest, not pity. Something about Grace Whitmore reminded him that there was still goodness in the world, even when it was hard to find. He thought about Sarah, about what she would have wanted him to do. She had always believed in helping those who couldn't help themselves. She had fed strangers who showed up at their door. She had nursed sick children whose parents couldn't afford the doctor. She had taught him that strength wasn't just about being hard. It was also about being kind. "I hope I'm doing the right thing," he said quietly to the darkness, to the ghost of his wife that sometimes felt present in these quiet moments. "I hope this doesn't hurt Danny." The night offered no answers, only the endless Texas sky full of stars and the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. Inside her small room off the kitchen, Grace lay on a real bed for the first time in weeks. The mattress was thin but clean. The pillow smelled of lavender. The door had a lock just as Wyatt had promised. She had checked it 3 times to be sure. Through the wall she could hear Rosa moving around in her own room getting ready for sleep. Above her she could hear Wyatt's heavy footsteps as he checked on Danny one final time before retiring. The house settled around her with creaks and sighs, the sounds of a place that had stood for years and would stand for years more. Grace touched the cut on her forehead, now cleaned and already beginning to heal. Physical wounds always healed faster than the other kind. She thought about the mob in town, about the hatred in their eyes. She thought about Randall Pierce, the man whose lie had destroyed her life. And she thought about the long road that had led her here to this ranch, to this unexpected sanctuary. Tomorrow the real work would begin. She would have to prove herself worthy of Wyatt Morgan's trust. She would have to navigate Rosa's skepticism and the ranch hand's judgment. She would have to face whatever consequences came from the town. But tonight, for the first time in 6 months, Grace Whitmore felt something she had almost forgotten. She felt safe. Morning came early, just as Wyatt had promised. Grace woke to darkness, the first hints of dawn barely touching the eastern sky. She dressed quickly in one of the 2 dresses she owned, both worn and patched but clean. Rosa had left a basin of water and a bar of soap on the washstand, and Grace scrubbed her face and hands, trying to make herself presentable. When she entered the kitchen, she found Rosa already there, moving efficiently between the stove and the work table. The older woman glanced at her, taking in her early arrival and neat appearance, and nodded with what might have been approval. "You can start with the biscuits," Rosa said, gesturing to the flour and lard. "Do you know how? My mother taught me." "Good. Make enough for 8. The ranch hands eat breakfast here." Grace set to work, her hands remembering the motions, even though it had been months since she'd had access to a proper kitchen. Measure the flour. Cut in the lard until it resembled coarse crumbs. Add just enough milk to bring it together. Pat it out, cut circles, place them on the baking sheet. As she worked, she became aware of sounds outside, horses being saddled, men's voices low and rough with early morning, the ranch waking up to face another day of endless work. By the time the biscuits were in the oven and Grace had moved on to frying eggs and bacon, the first of the ranch hands appeared. Jesse, a young man of about 25 with sun-bleached hair and an easy smile. He stopped short when he saw Grace, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion. "Morning, Miss Rosa," he said carefully, not acknowledging Grace. "Morning, Jesse. Sit. Food's almost ready." 2 more men filed in. Tom, who was older and missing 2 fingers on his left hand from some long-ago accident, and Carlos Rosa's nephew, who gave Grace a cautious nod but said nothing. The kitchen filled with the sounds and smells of breakfast, coffee brewing rich and dark, bacon sizzling, the warm yeasty scent of biscuits baking. It was comfortable domestic normal. Grace let herself sink into the routine, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of cooking. When Wyatt entered with Caleb, the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The ranch hands exchanged glances, clearly wondering what this stranger was doing in their kitchen. Wyatt took his seat at the head of the table without comment, and Caleb sat beside him, his expression carefully neutral. Grace and Rosa served the food. Scrambled eggs with fresh herbs Rosa had growing in pots by the window. Thick slices of bacon, biscuits with butter and honey. Strong black coffee. For several minutes everyone ate in uncomfortable silence. Then Jesse spoke up, his voice hesitant. "Miss, this coffee is different." Grace tensed, preparing for criticism. "I'm sorry. I can make it again if it's not to your liking." "No, ma'am. I mean it's good, real good, better than—" He stopped, suddenly aware that he was about to say something insulting to Rosa. Rosa, however, merely smiled. "Better than mine, you were going to say. It's all right, Sobrino. I know my coffee is strong enough to stand a spoon in." The tension in the room eased slightly. Tom reached for a second biscuit. Carlos asked for more eggs. Even Caleb's expression softened a fraction. But before the meal could end, the sound of horses approaching made everyone freeze. Multiple horses moving fast. Wyatt stood, his hand automatically dropping to the gun belt he'd strapped on before breakfast. "Stay inside," he told Grace, then headed for the front door with Caleb close behind. Grace moved to the window, ignoring the command. Rosa joined her, and together they watched as Wyatt stepped out onto the porch to face a group of 15 people from town. At the front was Reverend James Cole, his face set in stern lines. Beside him stood several women Grace recognized from yesterday's mob, and behind them a handful of men who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Reverend Cole raised his hand in greeting, but there was nothing friendly in the gesture. "Mr. Morgan, we need to speak with you about the woman you brought to your home yesterday." Wyatt crossed his arms, his stance making it clear he would not be moved. "What about her?" "She's a fallen woman, Mr. Morgan. She doesn't belong here near decent folk, near children. We've come to ask you for the good of the community to send her away." Inside, Grace felt her heart hammering. This was it. The moment when Wyatt would realize that keeping her wasn't worth the trouble, that his standing in the community mattered more than a promise to a stranger. She had been through this before in San Antonio, watching people who'd claimed to be her friends turn away one by one. "She's under my employment," Wyatt said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "What happens on my land is my business, not yours." A woman stepped forward, her face twisted with self-righteous anger. "We know what she did in San Antonio. She destroyed a marriage. She's a homewrecker and a sinner." Before Grace could stop herself, she pushed open the door and walked out onto the porch. Every eye turned to her. She saw hatred, disgust, fear, but she stood straight, shoulders back, and when she spoke, her voice didn't shake. "That's a lie." "Liar," someone shouted from the back. "I was falsely accused." Grace descended the porch steps, moving to stand beside Wyatt. "The man I refused spread that rumor to destroy me, but I will not beg for your belief, and I will not leave unless Mr. Morgan asks me to." The crowd murmured, angry and unsatisfied. Reverend Cole's face had gone red. "Mr. Morgan, if you harbor this woman, you're condoning sin. You're setting a dangerous example. Think of your son. Think of what people will say." All eyes turned to Wyatt. Grace held her breath. This was the moment. This was where he would choose his reputation over her. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving from face to face in the crowd. Then he looked at Grace, really looked at her, and she saw something in his eyes that she hadn't expected. Respect. He turned back to the crowd. "Miss Whitmore is employed in my household. She has done nothing to warrant dismissal. And if any of you have a problem with that, you're welcome to leave my property. This conversation is over." "But Mr. Morgan," Reverend Cole started, "I said this conversation is over. You're not welcome here unless invited. All of you, leave." The authority in his voice was absolute. This was a man who had commanded soldiers in wartime, who had built a successful ranch from nothing, who had survived losses that would have broken lesser men. The crowd hesitated, uncertain how to respond to such definitive dismissal. One by one they began to turn their horses. But the looks they gave Grace promised this was far from over. As they rode away, she heard fragments of conversation. "Protect his reputation." "What about the boy?" "Mark my words, this will end badly." When they were gone, Grace turned to Wyatt. "Thank you, but you didn't have to do that. I could have left." "No," Wyatt said simply. "You couldn't have. You have nowhere to go. I've managed before." "Barely." He met her eyes. "And I don't go back on my word. I hired you to do a job. Do the job. Earn your keep. Ignore everything else." Grace nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Behind them, Rosa clapped her hands. "Good. Now everyone back to work. The day doesn't stop because foolish people say foolish things." The ranch hands filed out, heading to their various tasks. Caleb lingered for a moment, catching Wyatt's eye. "You just made enemies of half the town." "Then it's a good thing I don't need their approval to run my ranch," Wyatt replied. Over the next several days, Grace threw herself into work with an intensity that surprised even Rosa. She rose before dawn and didn't stop until well after dark. She scrubbed floors until they gleamed. She washed every piece of linen in the house, hanging them to dry in the sun until they smelled like fresh air and sunshine. She mended torn clothes, darned socks, polished every piece of silver she could find. But more than the physical labor, she worked to make the meals special. Not fancy, but good. She baked bread that came out of the oven golden and perfect. She made stews rich with vegetables from Rosa's garden. She learned that Wyatt preferred his coffee strong and his steak rare, that Danny would only eat if his food was arranged in a specific way on his plate, that the ranch hands had been eating the same 5 meals in rotation for 3 years and were delighted by any variation. She also learned the rhythms of ranch life. The cattle needed constant attention. Fences always needed mending. Water sources had to be checked daily, especially in the brutal heat of a Texas summer. Horses required care. Equipment broke and had to be repaired. There was always work, endless work from sun-up to sundown. Most importantly, she made it her mission to reach Danny. Every evening she brought his dinner to his room. She never tried to force him to talk or even to acknowledge her. She simply sat on the floor far enough away to give him space and told him stories. Stories about her childhood in San Antonio, about the creek where she and her best friend Lily used to catch frogs, about her father who had taught her to shoot because he believed women should be able to defend themselves, about her mother who could stitch up a wound so carefully it barely left a scar. She never mentioned the scandal, never spoke of the darkness that had led her here. With Danny, she kept everything light, safe, gentle. On the 3rd evening, he let her sit a little closer. On the 5th, he showed her his wooden horse holding it out so she could see the intricate carving. On the 7th, as she stood to leave, his small hand reached out and touched her sleeve. Just for a second. But it was enough to make her heart soar. She mentioned it to no one, not even Rosa. This was Danny's secret, Danny's trust, and she would guard it fiercely. It was on the 10th day that everything changed. Grace was in the kitchen, elbow deep in pie dough, when she heard it. A sound so unexpected that she froze, flour-covered hands suspended in midair. Singing. Someone was singing. No, not someone. Danny. The voice was thin and uncertain, barely more than a whisper, but it was unmistakably a child singing the lullaby she had hummed to him the night before. Grace's heart stopped. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved slowly toward the sound, afraid that any sudden movement might break whatever spell had been cast. Danny sat at the kitchen table, the wooden horse in front of him, and he was singing. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, and the words tumbled out like water from a long-blocked spring. "Hush, little baby, don't say a word, Papa's gonna buy you a mockingbird. And if that mockingbird don't sing, Papa's gonna buy you a diamond ring." Grace knelt down beside him, tears streaming down her face. "Danny, can you hear me, sweetheart?" His eyes opened. For a moment he looked confused, as if waking from a dream. Then he looked at her, really looked at her, and his mouth formed words. "Miss Grace." "Yes, baby. I'm here." "Where's Papa?" "Let me get him. Don't move. Please don't move." Grace ran. She burst out of the house calling for Wyatt with a desperation that brought every ranch hand running. She found him in the barn checking a horse's hoof, and she grabbed his arm with both hands. Danny's talking. He's asking for you." Wyatt stared at her as if she'd spoken in tongues. "What?" "Your son is talking. Wyatt, he's talking." He dropped everything and ran. Grace followed along with Caleb and Rosa and the others. They crowded into the kitchen doorway, not wanting to overwhelm the boy, but unable to stay away. Danny still sat at the table looking small and uncertain. When he saw his father, his face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his cheeks. "Papa, I miss Mama." Wyatt fell to his knees beside the chair, gathering his son into his arms. His whole body shook as he held Danny, this child he'd thought might be lost forever, and he wept openly for the first time since Sarah's death. "I know, son. I miss her too. So much. Every single day." "Is she ever coming back?" "No, Danny. She's not coming back. She's in heaven now, watching over us. I tried to be quiet like Mama when she was sick. I tried so hard to be good so she wouldn't hurt." Understanding crashed over Wyatt like a wave. Danny had stopped talking because Sarah, in her final days, had been in so much pain that any noise seemed to hurt her. The boy had been trying in his own way to help, and then when she died anyway, he'd kept his silence as if it might somehow bring her back. "Oh, Danny. Sweet boy. Mama's pain wasn't your fault. Nothing you did or didn't do could have changed what happened. And she would want you to talk, to laugh, to be a child. She would want you to live." Danny cried harder, the tears and sobs of 2 years of bottled grief finally finding release. Wyatt held him through it all, rocking him gently, murmuring words of comfort and love. Grace backed away, giving them privacy, and found herself in Rosa's arms. The older woman held her while she cried, her own tears mixing with Grace's. "You did this," Rosa whispered. "You brought him back." "He was always there," Grace replied. "He just needed someone to believe he would return." When Danny's tears finally subsided, he pulled back from his father and looked around the kitchen. His gaze landed on Grace, and a small tentative smile crossed his face. "Miss Grace makes good pie." The tension broke. Everyone laughed, the sound filling the kitchen with warmth and joy. Grace wiped her eyes and smiled back at the boy. "I'm making apple pie right now. Would you like to help?" Danny nodded enthusiastically. And just like that, as if the last 2 years had been nothing but a bad dream, he began chattering about his wooden horse, about the creek, about a bird's nest he'd seen in the oak tree outside his window. That evening, for the first time in 2 years, Danny joined them at the dinner table. He sat between Wyatt and Grace, talking non-stop, as if making up for lost time. The ranch hands listened with indulgent smiles, asking questions, keeping the conversation going. After dinner, Grace helped Danny get ready for bed. He chattered the whole time, asking her questions about everything from where she came from to whether she liked horses better than cows. When she tucked him in, he looked up at her with those serious brown eyes. "Will you stay, Miss Grace? Will you be my mama now?" The question, so innocent and so complicated, made Grace's throat tight. "I'll stay as long as your papa lets me, and I'll take care of you always, I promise." "Good, because I love you." Simple words from a child who had just rediscovered his voice, but they hit Grace like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. No one had said those words to her in so long. She had begun to believe no one ever would again. "I love you too, Danny. Sleep well." She closed his door and leaned against the wall in the hallway, trying to compose herself. When she opened her eyes, Wyatt was standing there, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't know how you did it, but thank you. I didn't do anything special. I just listened." That was exactly what he needed. Wyatt moved closer. What we all needed. They stood in the hallway close enough that Grace could see the individual threads in Wyatt's shirt, could smell the lingering scent of horse and leather and sun on his skin. Close enough that she became acutely aware of him, not just as her employer, but as a man. A good man who had taken a chance on her when no one else would. "Mr. Morgan," she began, then stopped, not sure what she wanted to say. "Wyatt," he corrected gently. "I think we're past formalities now." "Wyatt, then. I just want you to know that this job, this place, it means more to me than you can possibly understand. You gave me back my dignity when the world tried to take it. You gave me a purpose, a home. I won't let you down." "I know you won't." He hesitated, then added, "And for what it's worth, having you here has been good for all of us. Not just Danny. This house feels like a home again." Before Grace could respond, before either of them could acknowledge the current of attraction that had suddenly sprung to life between them, the sound of approaching horses shattered the moment. Multiple horses moving fast, coming hard up the road to the ranch. Wyatt's expression went cold and hard. "Stay with Danny. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me or Rosa." "What's happening?" "I don't know, but nothing good comes from visitors after dark." He headed downstairs, and Grace heard him calling for Caleb and the other ranch hands. She hurried to Danny's room and locked the door as instructed, her heart pounding. Through the window she could see torches approaching, at least a dozen riders silhouetted against the night sky. And at the front of the group, sitting tall in his saddle and smiling like a man who held all the cards, was Randall Pierce. Randall Pierce dismounted with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to making entrances. Even in the flickering torchlight, Grace could see he was handsome in a calculated way. Dark hair swept back from a high forehead. Strong features that spoke of good breeding and better living. Expensive clothes that marked him as someone of consequence. But his eyes, even from a distance, held a coldness that made her blood run ice. She watched from Danny's window as Wyatt stepped out onto the porch, Caleb and the ranch hands flanking him. The two groups faced each other across the yard like opposing armies before a battle. "Mr. Morgan," Pierce called out, his voice smooth as silk. "I apologize for the late hour. I heard you had a new employee and thought I should come introduce myself." "We've met, Pierce. State your business or get off my land." Pierce smiled, unruffled by the hostility. "Straight to the point. I've always admired that about you, Wyatt." "Very well. I came to discuss the woman you're sheltering, Grace Whitmore." Grace's heart stopped. How did he know her full name? How had he found her so quickly? "Miss Whitmore is my employee. That's all you need to know." But you see, it's not quite that simple." Pierce gestured to one of his men who handed him a leather satchel. "I've taken the liberty of having my lawyers research Miss Whitmore's situation in San Antonio. Fascinating reading, really. The scandal, the accusations, the very public disgrace." "Get to the point." Pierce pulled papers from the satchel, holding them up to catch the torchlight. "These are sworn statements from witnesses in San Antonio. Testimony that your Miss Whitmore was indeed involved in an inappropriate relationship with a married man. That she pursued him relentlessly despite his repeated refusals. That she threatened to ruin him when he finally rejected her advances." "Those are lies." Grace couldn't stop herself from shouting through the window. Every head turned toward her voice. Pierce's smile widened. "Ah, there she is. Grace, my dear, it's been too long." Wyatt's whole body tensed. "You know her. Know her. I'm the man she tried to seduce back in San Antonio. When I refused her advances, being a gentleman and already engaged to another woman, she spread vicious rumors about me. Nearly cost me my engagement. I had to work very hard to clear my name." Grace felt the world tilting beneath her feet. The sheer audacity of the lie, the complete inversion of truth, left her breathless. Pierce was rewriting history, making himself the victim and her the predator. "That's not what happened," she said, her voice shaking now. "You know that's not what happened." Pierce turned his attention back to Wyatt. "You see what I mean? She can't even keep her story straight. Now, I'm a forgiving man, Mr. Morgan. I don't wish the woman ill. but I do think for the good of the community and for your own reputation you should reconsider employing her. Send her on her way, and we'll say no more about it." Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Grace held her breath, waiting for him to tell her to pack her things. Waiting for the moment when he would realize that keeping her wasn't worth the trouble Pierce was clearly prepared to make. Instead, Wyatt descended the porch steps, slowly moving into the torchlight where Pierce could see his face clearly. When he spoke, his voice was calm, but carried the weight of absolute authority. "I don't care what papers you have. I don't care what witnesses you've bought or what lies you've manufactured. Miss Whitmore is employed on my ranch, and she stays here as long as she chooses. Now get off my property." Pierce's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "I was hoping we could handle this civilly, as neighbors, as reasonable men. There's nothing civil about showing up at a man's home after dark with 12 armed riders. That's intimidation, Pierce, and I don't respond well to intimidation." "I see." Pierce carefully folded the papers and returned them to his satchel. "Then perhaps we should discuss this from a different angle. I've recently acquired the Henderson Ranch to your west, 2,000 acres, and the Collins property to your north, 1,500 acres. That puts me on 3 of your 4 borders, Wyatt. Makes us very close neighbors indeed." The threat was clear. Pierce was surrounding him, cutting him off. Wyatt's expression didn't change, but Grace saw his hand move closer to his gun. "Congratulations on your purchases. Doesn't change anything on my land." "Not yet, perhaps." Pierce swung back into his saddle. "But times change. Water sources dry up. Cattle get sick. Accidents happen, especially when people insist on keeping bad company." "Are you threatening me, Pierce?" "I'm simply pointing out facts. This country can be dangerous for people who don't have good neighbors watching their backs." He turned his horse. "Think about what I said, Wyatt. The offer to buy your land still stands, $12,000. That's generous considering the challenges you're about to face." "I'm not selling. Everyone has a price. You'll find yours soon enough." Pierce glanced back up at Danny's window where Grace still stood watching. Even in the darkness she could feel his gaze like a physical touch. "Take care, Grace. I'll be seeing you again very soon." Then he and his men were gone, riding back down the road in a cloud of dust and torchlight, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with unspoken threats. Grace unlocked Danny's door and hurried downstairs. She found Wyatt still standing in the yard, staring after Pierce's retreating group. Caleb stood beside him, shaking his head. "That's bad, Wyatt, real bad. Pierce doesn't make empty threats." "I know. He's going to come after you now, after the ranch, and it's all because of—" Caleb stopped when he saw Grace approaching. "Because of me," she finished for him. "He's right. I should leave, tonight, before Pierce does something to hurt you or Danny." Wyatt finally turned to look at her. In the moonlight, his face was carved from stone. "You're not leaving." "But you heard him. He'll destroy you if I stay." "Pierce was going to come after me eventually anyway. He's been trying to buy this land for 2 years. You're just a convenient excuse." Wyatt moved toward the house. "Caleb, double the watch tonight. 2 men at all times, and check the water sources first thing in the morning. If Pierce is planning something, that's where he'll start." "What about her?" Caleb gestured toward Grace. "You sure you want to protect her after hearing what Pierce said?" Wyatt stopped and looked back at his foreman. "Do you really believe those lies?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "No. I've seen the way she works, the way she cares for Danny. That's not a woman who destroys lives for sport." "Then we're agreed. Grace stays. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me directly." Later that night, after Danny had finally fallen back asleep and the ranch had settled into an uneasy quiet, Grace found herself unable to rest. She sat in the kitchen, a single lamp burning low on the table, staring at her hands and wondering how her life had spiraled so completely out of control. The sound of footsteps made her look up. Wyatt entered, carrying a bottle and 2 glasses. "Can't sleep either?" he asked. "Too much to think about." He poured whiskey into both glasses and slid one across the table to her. "Then maybe it's time you told me the whole story. The truth about what happened in San Antonio." Grace took a sip of the whiskey, feeling it burn down her throat and into her chest. Then slowly she began to talk. She told him about her life as a teacher at Mrs. Henderson's school for young ladies, about how she had loved her work, loved shaping young minds and seeing them grow, about Randall Pierce, who had started attending the school's public events 6 months ago, always finding reasons to speak with her to bring her flowers to request her company. I thought he was just being friendly at first, polite. But then the attention became more intense. He started showing up at my boarding house, sending me gifts I couldn't accept, writing me letters declaring his feelings. And you weren't interested. I found him arrogant and cold. The way he spoke to servants, to people he considered beneath him, it made my skin crawl. I refused his advances as politely as I could, but he didn't accept it well. She described the night Pierce had come to her room at the boarding house, drunk and insistent, how he'd tried to force himself on her, how she'd fought him off, breaking a lamp over his head and screaming until other residents came running. He left bleeding and furious. The next morning he went to Mrs. Henderson and told her I'd invited him to my room and then attacked him when he refused my advances. He showed her the wound on his head as proof. Wyatt's jaw clenched. And she believed him. He was Randall Pierce from one of the oldest families in Texas. I was just a teacher, no family, no connections. Who do you think she believed? Grace's voice broke. Within a week everyone knew, or thought they knew. Parents pulled their daughters from my classes. The other teachers stopped speaking to me. I was dismissed without references. And the scandal about the married man. Pierce's final touch. He spread rumors that I'd been involved with Thomas Howe, his business partner's husband. Catherine Howe was well loved in society. The thought that I'd tried to steal her husband made me not just unwanted but hated. I had to leave San Antonio before someone decided to do more than throw words at me. Wyatt was quiet for a long time, processing her story. Finally he asked, "Why didn't you go to the law and say what a wealthy, powerful man tried to force himself on me, and when I refused, he destroyed my reputation? You know as well as I do that the law doesn't protect women like me from men like him." "You're right." Wyatt drained his glass. "I'm sorry that happened to you, and I'm sorry he found you here." "How did he find me? How did he even know I'd left San Antonio?" "Pierce has connections everywhere. Money buys information." Wyatt refilled both their glasses. "The question now is what he wants. And I don't think it's just about you." "What do you mean? Pierce showing up here tonight with all those papers, all that preparation? That takes time. He's been tracking you, yes. But he's also been positioning himself around my ranch, buying up land. I think you're a tool he's planning to use to get what he really wants." "Your land. My land." Wyatt nodded grimly. "And he'll use you to get it. He'll make it impossible for me to keep you here socially and economically. He'll isolate us, cut off our resources, make people choose between doing business with me or with him. And eventually he thinks I'll give up, send you away to save myself." Grace felt sick. "Then I really should leave. I won't let him destroy you because of me." "If you leave, he wins. He learns that he can manipulate anyone into doing what he wants by applying enough pressure. And next time it won't be about you. It'll be about something else, someone else." Wyatt met her eyes. "I'm tired of men like Pierce getting away with cruelty because good people won't stand against them." "Standing against him could cost you everything." "Then let it cost. Some things are worth fighting for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning that went beyond just the current situation. Grace found herself looking at Wyatt Morgan, really looking at him, seeing past the hard exterior to the man beneath. A man who had lost so much, yet still chose kindness. Who had every reason to be bitter, yet remained principled. Who was willing to fight for a woman he barely knew, simply because it was the right thing to do. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing me, for protecting me, for everything." Wyatt reached across the table and covered her hand with his. The touch was brief, gentle, but it sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Get some rest, Grace. Tomorrow we prepare for whatever Pierce has planned." But tomorrow came sooner and more violently than anyone expected. Grace woke to the sound of men shouting and the acrid smell of smoke. She threw on her dress and ran outside to find Caleb and the ranch hands gathered near the water trough pointing toward the western pasture. "What's happening?" she called out. "The creek," Caleb said grimly. "Something's wrong with the water." She followed them down to where the creek ran through Morgan property. What she saw made her stomach drop. Dead fish floated on the surface. The water, usually clear and cold, had a strange oily sheen, and along the bank 3 cattle lay dead foam around their mouths. Wyatt appeared, taking in the scene with one comprehensive glance. "Poisoned. Someone poisoned the water source upstream." "Pierce," Caleb spat. "Can we prove it?" "His land is upstream now. Who else would it be?" Wyatt knelt by the creek, examining the water carefully. "Get the cattle away from here, all of them. Move them to the eastern pasture where they can drink from the spring, and somebody ride to town, fetch Doc Harrison. I need to know what kind of poison this is." As the men scrambled to follow orders, Grace noticed Wyatt's expression. He looked exhausted, defeated in a way she'd never seen. This ranch was his life, his legacy for Danny, and Pierce was systematically trying to destroy it. "What can I do?" she asked. "Keep Danny away from the creek. Don't let him or Rosa use any water from it. We'll have to haul water from the spring until this clears." "How long will that take?" "Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how much poison was used and whether it's still leaching into the water upstream." He stood jaw tight with anger. "And even if it clears, we've lost 3 head of cattle already. Maybe more if any others drank from it yesterday." Over the next few days, the scale of Pierce's sabotage became clear. 7 cattle dead in total, the creek water still unsafe. And worse, when Wyatt tried to order supplies in town, 3 merchants refused to sell to him. "Pierce has been talking to them," the feed store owner explained apologetically. "Says anyone who does business with you is supporting a fallen woman and can't be trusted. I've got a wife and kids to feed Wyatt. I can't afford to lose Pierce's business." Similar responses came from the blacksmith, the dry goods store, and even the livery. Pierce's money and influence were slowly strangling them. Grace watched Wyatt grow more drawn and tired with each passing day. He worked from before dawn until after dark, managing the crisis, trying to keep the ranch running with depleted resources. And all the while she knew it was because of her. One evening, as she brought dinner to Danny's room, she found the boy unusually quiet. He'd been talking non-stop since finding his voice again, but tonight he just picked at his food. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" she asked. "The boys in town, the ones I used to play with before Mama died. They said their parents won't let them talk to me anymore because of you." Grace felt her heart break. "Oh, Danny, I'm so sorry. They said you're a bad woman, that Papa shouldn't let you stay here." He looked up at her with those serious brown eyes. "But you're not bad. You're nice. You brought me back. Sometimes people believe things that aren't true, and sometimes they hurt innocent people because of those beliefs. That's not fair." "No, it's not. But that's why it's important to always think for yourself, to judge people by their actions, not by what others say about them." Danny nodded slowly. Then, with the blunt honesty of children, he asked, "Are you going to leave? Do you want me to leave?" "No, I want you to stay forever. I want you to be my mama." The words hit Grace like a physical blow. She gathered Danny into her arms, holding him close. "I'll stay as long as your father lets me. I promise." But even as she made the promise, she wondered how long that would be. How long before the pressure became too much? How long before Wyatt decided that keeping her wasn't worth the cost? The answer came sooner than she expected. A week after the water poisoning, Grace was working in the garden when Rosa called her inside. The older woman's face was grave. "There are people here to see you. From San Antonio." Grace's blood turned to ice. She followed Rosa to the front parlor, where 2 well-dressed women sat stiffly on the sofa. She recognized them immediately. Mrs. Catherine Howe and Mrs. Eleanor Standish, 2 of the most prominent society women in San Antonio. "Miss Whitmore," Mrs. Howe said coldly, "we've come a long way to speak with you." I have nothing to say to either of you. Perhaps you'll feel differently when you hear what we have to offer." Mrs. Standish pulled an envelope from her reticule. "Mr. Pierce has asked us to serve as intermediaries in this unfortunate situation. I want nothing from Randall Pierce. Not even the truth." Mrs. Howe opened her own bag and withdrew a sheaf of papers. "These are signed affidavits from 3 witnesses who claim to have seen you entering Mr. Pierce's hotel room on multiple occasions, who claim to have heard you professing your love for him, who claim to have witnessed you threatening him when he rejected you." Grace stared at the papers, knowing they were fabrications, but seeing how official they looked, how convincing. "Those are lies, all of it." "Perhaps, but they're lies that will be believed. Mr. Pierce is prepared to distribute these affidavits to every person in this county, to every business owner, every rancher, every family. By the time he's done, Mr. Morgan won't be able to sell a single head of cattle. He'll be ruined, and it will be entirely your fault." The cruelty of it took Grace's breath away. Pierce wasn't just attacking her. He was using her as a weapon against Wyatt, knowing that her continued presence would destroy everything Wyatt had built. "What does Pierce want?" Mrs. Standish smiled thinly. "He wants you gone. Leave today. Leave Texas entirely. Go somewhere you'll never be heard from again. Do that, and Mr. Pierce will ensure these affidavits are destroyed. More than that, he'll put out word that you were falsely accused, that he's discovered the truth about what really happened. He'll clear my name. In Texas, at least. You could start over somewhere else with a clean slate." It was tempting, so tempting, to have her reputation restored, to be able to walk down a street without people whispering, to not be the cause of Wyatt's suffering. But it would mean leaving Danny, leaving Wyatt, leaving the first real home she'd had in months. "And if I refuse," Mrs. Howe's expression turned hard, "then Mr. Morgan will lose everything, his business, his reputation, possibly even custody of his son when the court hears he's been allowing a woman of questionable morals to care for the child." "He wouldn't," Grace breathed. "He would, and he could. Mr. Pierce has connections in the territorial government, judges who owe him favors. It would be remarkably easy to paint Mr. Morgan as an unfit father." Grace felt trapped, suffocating under the weight of impossible choices. If she stayed, Wyatt would be destroyed. If she left, Pierce would win, learning he could manipulate anyone through cruelty and lies. "I need time to think." "You have until tomorrow morning. After that, Mr. Pierce will begin distributing the affidavits." The 2 women stood. "Choose wisely, Miss Whitmore. A man's future and a child's welfare hang in the balance." After they left, Grace sat alone in the parlor, tears streaming down her face. Rosa found her there an hour later. What did those women want? Grace told her everything. About Pierce's ultimatum, about the affidavits, about the threat to take Danny away from Wyatt. Rosa listened in silence, her weathered face growing darker with each word. When Grace finished, the older woman sat down beside her and took her hands. "That man is El Diablo himself, pure evil. What do I do, Rosa, if I stay? Wyatt loses everything. But if I leave, Pierce wins. You do what your heart tells you is right, and you trust that God will protect those who stand for justice." "God hasn't been protecting me very well lately." Rosa smiled sadly. "Maybe God brought you here for a reason. Maybe this is where you're meant to be, where you're meant to fight." "I'm so tired of fighting." "I know, mija, I know." That evening, Grace packed her few belongings into a worn carpet bag. She would leave before dawn, before Wyatt could try to stop her, before Danny woke up and asked where she was going. It was the only way to protect them. She was writing a letter to Wyatt explaining her decision when she heard a sound from Danny's room. Crying. Soft, heartbroken sobbing. Grace put down her pen and went upstairs. Danny was sitting on his bed, tears streaming down his face, clutching the wooden horse. "Danny, what's wrong? I heard you packing. You're leaving, just like Mama left." Grace knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers. "Sweetheart, I'm not leaving because I want to. I'm leaving to protect you and your papa." "From what?" How could she explain adult cruelty to a 7-year-old? How could she make him understand that sometimes love meant walking away? There's a bad man who wants to hurt your papa, and the only way to stop him is for me to go. But you promised you'd stay. I know, and I'm so sorry I have to break that promise. Danny pulled away from her, his face flushed with anger and betrayal. Mama promised she'd never leave me too, but she did. And now you're leaving. Everyone always leaves. He ran past her and down the stairs. Grace heard the front door slam. She raced after him, calling his name, but the boy had already disappeared into the darkness. Panic seized her. It was night. The ranch was huge. Danny could get lost, could fall and hurt himself, could encounter any number of dangers. She ran to the barn where Wyatt was checking on a horse with an injured leg. Danny ran off. He thinks I'm leaving and he's upset. Wyatt's face went pale. Which direction? I don't know. He was so fast. Wyatt called for Caleb and the other ranch hands. Within minutes they were organizing a search party, grabbing lanterns and spreading out across the property. Grace joined the search despite Wyatt's protests that she should stay at the house. She couldn't sit idle while Danny was out there alone, scared and feeling abandoned. She walked along the creek calling his name, her heart hammering with fear. The moon was half full, providing some light, but the shadows were deep and treacherous. Then she heard it. A small voice singing, the lullaby she'd taught Danny. She followed the sound to a large oak tree near the creek. Danny sat in the branches about 10 feet up, still clutching his wooden horse. Danny, thank God. Please come down. I'm not coming down. If you're going to leave, then I'm leaving too. I'll live in this tree forever. Sweetheart, you can't live in a tree. Mama used to say I could do anything if I believed hard enough. So I believe I can live in a tree. Grace felt tears streaming down her face. This brave, broken boy who had already lost so much, who had just found his voice again only to face another loss. Danny, will you let me come up there with you? He nodded hesitantly. Grace hadn't climbed a tree since she was a child, but she managed to pull herself up to the branch where Danny sat. They sat side by side, legs dangling, looking out at the moonlit landscape. I don't want you to go, Danny said softly. I don't want to go either. Then why are you... Grace thought about all the complicated adult reasons, about Pierce's threats and the affidavits and the danger to Wyatt's ranch. But in the end, she said simply, because I love you and your papa too much to let you get hurt because of me. But we'll get hurt if you leave. Papa's sad when you're not around, and I need you. You're the only mama I remember. The words broke something open in Grace's chest. She wrapped her arm around Danny's shoulders and pulled him close. Then maybe I should stay. Maybe together we're strong enough to face whatever comes. Really? You'll stay? Before Grace could answer, a voice called from below. Danny, Grace, are you up there? Wyatt stood at the base of the tree, lantern in hand, his face etched with worry and relief. We're here, Grace called down. We're safe. Wyatt helped them down from the tree, checking Danny carefully for injuries before pulling the boy into a tight hug. Don't ever scare me like that again. Sorry, Papa, but Miss Grace was going to leave and I couldn't let her. Wyatt looked at Grace over Danny's head. In the lantern light, his eyes were unreadable. We should talk, all of us, back at the house. In the kitchen, with Rosa and Caleb present as witnesses, Grace told Wyatt about the visit from Mrs. Howe and Mrs. Standish, about Pierce's ultimatum, about the threat to take Danny away. Wyatt listened in silence, his jaw growing tighter with each word. When she finished, he stood and paced to the window, staring out at the dark landscape. So Pierce thinks he can force you out by threatening my son. He's not bluffing, Wyatt. He has the connections to do everything he's promised. Then let him try. Wyatt turned back to face her. I've survived a war, the death of my wife, nearly losing my son to grief. I'll be damned if I let Randall Pierce dictate what happens on my own land. But Danny needs you. We all do, more than we need Pierce's approval or the town's acceptance. Wyatt moved closer. You're not leaving, Grace, not unless you want to. And even then, I'd try to talk you out of it. Why would you risk everything for me? The question hung in the air. Wyatt looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. Something raw and honest and terrifying in its intensity. Because in the 2 weeks you've been here, this house has felt like a home again. Because you brought my son back from a darkness I thought would consume him. Because every morning I wake up and think about seeing you. Because... He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. Because I'm falling in love with you, Grace Whitmore, and I'll be damned if I let Pierce or anyone else take that away. The world seemed to stop. Grace stared at Wyatt, hardly able to breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever looked at her with such honest emotion. "I'm falling in love with you too," she whispered. "I have been since the day you defended me against the town, but I'm terrified that loving you will destroy you. Then we'll be destroyed together, but we won't run. We won't give Pierce the satisfaction." Danny, who had been watching this exchange with wide eyes, suddenly smiled. "Does this mean you're staying, Miss Grace?" Grace laughed through her tears. "Yes, sweetheart, I'm staying." "And does it mean you and Papa are going to get married?" The question, so innocent and so complicated, made both adults freeze. But before either could answer, the sound of breaking glass shattered the moment. All the windows along the front of the house exploded inward simultaneously, showering the room with shards. Everyone hit the floor instinctively. Through the broken windows, Grace could see torches, dozens of them, surrounding the house, and Pierce's voice, amplified somehow, called out from the darkness. "Mr. Morgan, I gave you a chance to handle this civilly. You refused. Now we do things my way. Send out the woman, or we burn you out." Wyatt crawled to the gun cabinet, pulling out rifles and shotguns. He tossed one to Caleb, another to Rosa, who caught it with practiced ease. "Anyone who doesn't want to fight, get to the root cellar now," Wyatt ordered. No one moved toward the cellar. "We stand with you, boss," Jesse said, materializing from the back of the house with Tom and Carlos. All three were armed. Grace looked around at these people, this makeshift family that had formed around her. They were willing to fight, possibly to die, because Pierce had forced them to choose between surrendering to cruelty or standing for what was right. She couldn't let that happen. Before anyone could stop her, Grace stood and walked toward the shattered front window. "Don't!" Wyatt shouted, but she was already there, visible to everyone outside. "Randall Pierce," she called out. "If you want me, come and get me yourself. Stop hiding behind your men and your money. Face me like the coward you are." A long silence. Then Pierce's figure detached from the darkness, walking into the firelight. He was smiling. "Brave words, Grace, but bravery won't save you now." "Maybe not, but the truth will. I know what you did. I know about the hotel ledger that proves you were never in that room when you claimed I was there. I know about the witnesses you paid off. I know everything." It was a bluff. She knew nothing. But she said it with such conviction that she saw Pierce's smile falter. "You're lying." "Am I? How sure are you? Sure enough to risk your reputation, your engagement? Because if this goes to trial, if all your lies come to light, you'll be the one destroyed." Pierce's hand moved toward his gun. "Then I'll make sure it never goes to trial." Everything happened at once. Pierce drew his weapon. Wyatt burst through the door, tackling Grace to the porch floor. A gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering wood where Grace had been standing seconds before. And then chaos erupted. Pierce's men opened fire on the house. The ranch hands fired back. The night exploded with muzzle flashes and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Grace found herself dragged inside by Wyatt, who positioned himself between her and the windows. Around them, bullets thudded into walls and furniture. Danny was screaming. Rosa was praying in rapid Spanish. Caleb was shouting orders to conserve ammunition. "This is insane!" Grace yelled over the noise. "Someone's going to die." "That's what Pierce wants," Wyatt replied, firing through a broken window. "He wants us dead or broken. Either way, he gets the land." The shooting continued for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. An eerie silence fell. Pierce's voice called out again. "Last chance, Morgan, send out the woman, or I burn the house with all of you inside." Grace looked around at the terrified faces, at Danny crying in Rosa's arms, at Caleb bleeding from a graze wound on his arm, at Wyatt, jaw set in determination but eyes showing the strain. This was her fault, all of it. She had brought this violence to these good people. "I'm ending this," she said, standing. "Grace, no!" Wyatt grabbed her arm. She looked at him, memorizing his face, the strong jaw, the winter blue eyes, the expression that somehow combined hardness with tenderness. This man who had given her back her dignity, who had believed in her when no one else would, who had said he was falling in love with her. "I love you, Wyatt Morgan, and that's why I have to do this." She pulled free and walked toward the door before anyone could stop her. Behind her she heard Wyatt shouting, heard footsteps running, but she was already outside, hands raised, walking toward Pierce's position. "I'm here," she called out. "Let them go. I'll leave with you. I'll go wherever you want. Just don't hurt them." Pierce emerged from the shadows, still holding his gun. His smile was triumphant. "Now that's more like it. Finally showing some sense." He grabbed her arm roughly, pulling her toward his horse. Grace didn't resist. This was the price of keeping the people she loved safe. But before Pierce could mount up, a new voice cut through the night. "Randall Pierce, you're under arrest." Everyone turned. Marshal Tom Brennan rode into the firelight, flanked by 4 deputies, all with weapons drawn. Behind them came more riders, town council members, Reverend Cole, Doc Harrison, a dozen citizens of Broken Creek. Pierce's face went white. "Marshal, what is the meaning of this?" "The meaning," Marshal Brennan said coldly, "is that you just committed assault with deadly weapons, attempted murder, and about 6 other crimes in front of witnesses. Drop your gun, now." "These people are trespassing on my property. I was defending myself." "This isn't your property, and 20 people just watched you shoot first. Not to mention the small matter of you admitting to bribing witnesses and manufacturing evidence." The marshal gestured to a young man holding up a small device. "Turns out the telegraph operator's son is quite clever with that new recording machine. Got your whole confession, Pierce, right from your own mouth." Pierce looked around wildly, seeing his trapped situation. His men were already lowering their weapons, unwilling to face down the marshal and his deputies. He was alone, cornered, finished. With a roar of rage, he swung his gun toward Grace. 2 shots rang out simultaneously. One from Wyatt, who had run out of the house the moment Grace walked outside. One from Marshal Brennan. Both hit Pierce in the shoulder and chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the ground. Grace stood frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Then Wyatt was there, pulling her into his arms, checking her for injuries, his hands shaking. "Don't ever do that again," he said roughly. "Don't ever try to sacrifice yourself. Do you understand me? Never again." Grace buried her face in his chest and sobbed, with relief, with exhaustion, with the release of weeks of fear and tension. Around them, Pierce's men were being disarmed and arrested. Doc Harrison was tending to Pierce's wounds, though the man was conscious and cursing. The citizens of Broken Creek were talking excitedly, processing what they'd just witnessed. Marshal Brennan approached Wyatt and Grace. "Sorry we cut it so close. When that recording came through the telegraph office, I knew we had to move fast. Didn't know Pierce would go this far." "How did you get the recording?" Wyatt asked. The marshal gestured to the telegraph operator's son, a gangly youth of about 16. "Young Timothy here has been experimenting with Mr. Edison's phonograph technology." When Grace shouted about knowing Pierce's secrets, Pierce took the bait and started talking. Timothy was hiding in the bushes with his recording device. Got every word. Grace looked at the young man with wonder. "You saved us." Timothy blushed. "I just wanted to help, ma'am. My sister was treated poorly by Pierce a few years back. Lost her position because she refused his advances. When I heard what was happening here, I knew we had to stop him." Reverend Cole stepped forward, his face deeply troubled. "Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology. We all do. We believed the lies without question. We judged you without mercy. That was wrong." Other townspeople echoed the sentiment. Women who had thrown stones now looked ashamed. Men who had refused to sell supplies now offered credit. It was a complete reversal, and while Grace appreciated it, she also felt the bitter irony. Her worth hadn't changed, only their perception of it. "I accept your apology," she said quietly, "but I hope you'll remember this the next time someone needs your compassion instead of your judgment." As Pierce was loaded into a wagon to be taken to the territorial jail, he looked back at Grace with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "I have lawyers. I have money. I'll be out in a week." Marshal Brennan shook his head. "Not this time, Pierce. Attempted murder of a woman in front of 24 witnesses, conspiracy, bribery. You're looking at 20 years minimum. Your money can't buy your way out of this." Pierce's face crumpled as the reality set in. His empire, built on cruelty and manipulation, was finally collapsing around him. As the wagon rolled away and the crowd began to disperse, Grace found herself alone with Wyatt in the yard. Dawn was breaking, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. The house was damaged but standing. No one had been killed. They had survived. "What happens now?" Grace asked. Wyatt took her hands in his. "Now we rebuild. We repair the damage. We move forward." He paused. "Together, if you'll have me." "Have you?" "Marry me, Grace. Not because you need protection or I need a housekeeper, but because I love you, because Danny loves you, because we're a family already and we should make it official." Grace thought about everything that had led her to this moment. The scandal, the stones, the long walk to Broken Creek, the fear and the hope and the impossible choice to stay instead of run. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I'll marry you." Wyatt kissed her as the sun rose over Morgan Valley Ranch, marking the end of one battle and the beginning of something new. Something built not on lies, but on truth. Not on cruelty, but on kindness. Not on fear, but on love. Inside the house, Danny watched from a window and smiled. Everything was going to be okay. The morning after the confrontation, Grace woke to find the ranch transformed. Citizens from Broken Creek had arrived at dawn bringing lumber tools and willing hands. The same people who had shunned her 3 weeks ago were now working to repair the damage Pierce had caused. Women swept up broken glass while men patched bullet holes and replaced shattered windows. It was a remarkable reversal, though Grace couldn't help feeling the bitter irony of it all. She stood on the porch watching the activity when Doc Harrison approached. The elderly physician carried his medical bag and wore an expression of deep regret. "Miss Whitmore, might I have a word?" Grace gestured to the rocking chairs. They sat, and for a moment the doctor simply looked out at the bustling yard. "I've been practicing medicine for 42 years, he began. "I've seen a lot of cruelty in that time, a lot of good people destroyed by lies and prejudice. But I've rarely seen someone face it with as much dignity as you have. I didn't have much choice. We always have choices. You chose not to become bitter, not to lash out at those who wronged you. That takes a strength most people don't possess." He reached into his bag and pulled out an envelope. "This came through the telegraph office this morning. It's from a colleague of mine in San Antonio, Mrs. Catherine Howe." Grace's chest tightened. The woman whose husband she'd supposedly seduced. What does she want? To apologize and to tell the truth. Doc Harrison handed her the envelope. "It seems Mrs. Howe never believed the rumors about you and her husband. She knew they were false, but Pierce threatened her, said he'd destroy her husband's business if she didn't play along. She's been carrying that guilt for 6 months." Grace opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter written in elegant script. "Dear Miss Whitmore, I do not expect your forgiveness, nor do I deserve it. I allowed an innocent woman to be destroyed because I was too cowardly to stand against Randall Pierce. My husband never strayed, never even looked at another woman. I knew the accusations were lies from the beginning. Pierce came to me the day after you refused him. He said if I didn't corroborate his story about your involvement with Thomas, he would reveal certain financial irregularities in my husband's business dealings. Irregularities that didn't actually exist, but that Pierce had the resources to manufacture convincing evidence of. I chose my husband's reputation over yours. I chose wrong. Now that Pierce has been exposed, I am writing to every person in San Antonio who heard those lies. I am telling them the truth, that you were innocent, that you were the victim of a powerful man's vengeance. It won't undo the damage, but perhaps it will restore some of what was taken from you. I am so very sorry. Catherine Howe. Grace read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to the envelope. She felt no satisfaction in the vindication, only a deep weariness. This letter couldn't give her back the 6 months of suffering, couldn't erase the memory of stones and hatred, couldn't undo the fear that still woke her in the middle of the night. "She means well," Doc Harrison said gently, "but I imagine her apology feels rather hollow now." "It does," Grace admitted, "though I suppose it's better than nothing. For what it's worth, you have the whole town's apology as well, though I know that doesn't erase what they put you through." Grace looked at the doctor. "What changed their minds? Why believe me now when they wouldn't before? Because they saw Pierce's true nature, because they heard the recording, because sometimes people need overwhelming evidence before they'll question their own prejudices." He sighed. "It's not fair. You shouldn't have had to nearly die before they'd see you as human, but that's the world we live in. And if Pierce had succeeded in killing me, would they have believed then that I deserved it?" The doctor had no answer for that. The trial of Randall Pierce began 2 weeks later in the Territorial Courthouse in Austin. Wyatt insisted on accompanying Grace along with Rosa and Danny. Marshal Brennan and the other witnesses from Broken Creek made the journey as well. It was a considerable disruption to the ranch's operations, but Wyatt was adamant. "I want Pierce to see that you have people standing with you," he told Grace as they prepared for the trip. "I want him to know he failed to isolate you." The courthouse was an imposing building of limestone and oak designed to intimidate those who entered seeking justice. Grace felt small walking up its broad steps, surrounded by lawyers in expensive suits and curious onlookers who had heard about the scandalous case. Pierce's attorney was Marcus Whitfield, one of the most prominent lawyers in Texas. He was silver-haired and distinguished, with a voice that could charm juries and intimidate witnesses. He approached Grace before the trial began, his smile professional but cold. "Miss Whitmore, my client has authorized me to make you an offer. Drop the charges, leave Texas permanently, and he'll ensure you receive $5,000. Enough to start over anywhere in the country." Grace didn't even hesitate. "No. Think carefully. A trial will be ugly. We'll have to discuss your past in detail. Your reputation, such as it is, will be dragged through every newspaper in the territory. Is that really what you want?" "What I want is justice." Whitfield's smile turned sharp. "Justice is a luxury, Miss Whitmore, and it comes at a very high price." The trial lasted 3 days. Whitfield was as skilled as his reputation suggested, painting Grace as a scheming woman who had pursued his client relentlessly. He called witnesses who claimed to have seen Grace entering Pierce's hotel. He produced letters that Pierce claimed Grace had written declaring her obsessive love for him. "These letters are forgeries," Grace said from the witness stand, her voice steady despite the hostile stares from Pierce's supporters in the gallery. "I never wrote to Mr. Pierce except to refuse his advances. You're accusing my client of forgery, of manufacturing evidence." Whitfield's tone dripped with skepticism. "Isn't it more likely that you wrote these letters in a moment of passion and now regret it?" "No. It's more likely that a man accustomed to getting what he wants became enraged when a woman dared to refuse him." The prosecutor, a young man named James Rutherford, did his best to counter Whitfield's attacks. He played the recording of Pierce's confession. He called Timothy, the telegraph operator's son, to testify about how the recording was made. He brought forward witness after witness from Broken Creek who described the attack on Wyatt's ranch. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. On the second day of the trial, a woman entered the courtroom. She was young, perhaps 23, with auburn hair and tired eyes. She wore a simple dress and clutched a worn Bible. When the prosecutor called her name, Grace didn't recognize it. "Miss Emma Thornton, please tell the court how you know the defendant." Emma's voice shook as she spoke. "Mr. Pierce employed me as a governess for his nephew 3 years ago. I was 18. He told me he loved me, that he wanted to marry me. I believed him." The courtroom went silent. Even Pierce's supporters seemed to lean forward. "What happened, Miss Thornton?" He came to my room one night, said we should celebrate our engagement privately. I told him we weren't engaged, that he'd never actually proposed. He said that didn't matter, that I belonged to him now. Emma's hands tightened on the Bible. He forced himself on me. When I threatened to tell his family, he said no one would believe a governess over a Pierce. And he was right. When I finally found the courage to report it to the local marshal, I was told there wasn't enough evidence, that it was my word against his. "Lies!" Pierce shouted from the defense table, half rising. His lawyer pulled him back down, whispering urgently. "Why are you coming forward now?" the prosecutor asked. "Because I read about Miss Whitmore in the newspaper, about what Mr. Pierce did to her, and I realized I couldn't stay silent anymore. If my testimony helps prevent him from hurting anyone else, then maybe some good can come from what happened to me." The prosecutor nodded solemnly. "Thank you, Miss Thornton. Your bravery in speaking out is commendable." Whitfield tried to discredit Emma during cross-examination, suggesting she was lying for attention or money. But Emma remained calm, answering every question with quiet dignity. By the time she left the stand, several jury members were looking at Pierce with undisguised disgust. On the third day, Grace herself took the stand. The prosecutor led her through her story methodically: her employment as a teacher, Pierce's unwanted attention, the night he came to her room, the lies he spread afterward. "And why did you refuse Mr. Pierce's advances?" the prosecutor asked. Grace looked directly at the jury. "Because he wasn't a good man. I saw how he treated people he considered beneath him, servants, workers, anyone without wealth or status. He was cruel and dismissive. Those are not qualities I admire in any person, regardless of their social standing. So you refused him not because you had another relationship, not because you were playing hard to get, but simply because you didn't like his character." "Yes." "And how did that make you feel to be pursued by someone whose character you found wanting?" Grace thought carefully before answering. "Afraid. Men like Mr. Pierce aren't accustomed to being told no. I knew refusing him was dangerous. I just didn't realize how dangerous until it was too late." During cross-examination, Whitfield tried to break her down. He questioned every detail of her story, looking for inconsistencies. He suggested she had led Pierce on and then changed her mind. He implied she was testifying now only because she saw an opportunity for revenge. "Isn't it true, Miss Whitmore, that you're now engaged to Mr. Wyatt Morgan, a wealthy rancher?" "Yes." "And isn't it convenient that by destroying Mr. Pierce, you eliminate a rival for local influence and resources?" Grace felt anger flare in her chest. Mr. Morgan never sought influence or rivalry with Mr. Pierce. It was Pierce who attacked us, who poisoned our water, who tried to burn down our home with a child inside. This isn't about rivalry. It's about stopping a dangerous man from hurting anyone else." "So you claim. But you're hardly an unbiased witness, are you? You have everything to gain from Mr. Pierce's conviction." "I have nothing to gain except the peace of knowing he can't hurt anyone else the way he hurt me, the way he hurt Emma Thornton, the way he's probably hurt countless other women who were too afraid to come forward." Whitfield's expression hardened. "Move to strike that last statement as speculation, Your Honor." "Sustained. The jury will disregard." But the damage was done. The jury had heard it, and judging by their expressions, they believed it. The final testimony came from Wyatt. He described finding Grace in town, hiring her, watching her work tirelessly to prove her worth. He described the poison in the creek, the intimidation, the attack on his home. "Why did you defend her?" Whitfield asked during cross-examination. "You barely knew this woman. Why risk your ranch, your son, everything you'd built?" Wyatt looked at Pierce as he answered. "Because she was innocent. Because letting cruelty win makes us all less human. Because standing up for what's right is more important than protecting what's comfortable." "Very noble. Or perhaps you simply wanted the woman for yourself and saw an opportunity. If I wanted a woman, I could court one without putting my son in danger. I defended Grace because it was the right thing to do, nothing more complicated than that." When both sides had rested their cases, the judge gave his instructions to the jury. They deliberated for 6 hours. Grace spent that time in a small room with Wyatt, Rosa, and Danny, unable to eat or think or do anything but wait. Finally, the bailiff came to summon them back to the courtroom. The jury foreman was a middle-aged rancher with weathered hands and a stern expression. He stood when the judge asked if they had reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of attempted murder, how do you find guilty?" Pierce's face went white. His lawyer put a hand on his shoulder, but Pierce shook it off. "On the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, guilty. On the charges of conspiracy, destruction of property, and intimidation, guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted. Pierce's supporters shouted in disbelief. Others cheered. The judge hammered his gavel, calling for order. When silence finally returned, the judge looked at Pierce with cold contempt. "Mr. Pierce, you have been found guilty of serious crimes. Crimes that demonstrate a pattern of using your wealth and position to harm those who displease you. This court will not tolerate such behavior." He paused. "I hereby sentence you to 20 years in the territorial prison with no possibility of parole for 15 years. In addition, you are ordered to pay restitution to Mr. Morgan for damages to his property and to Miss Whitmore for defamation of character." Pierce finally broke. He lurched to his feet, face contorted with rage. "This is a travesty. I'm a Pierce. My family built this territory. You can't do this to me." "I just did." Bailiff, remove the prisoner. As Pierce was dragged from the courtroom, still shouting about injustice and corruption, Grace felt something release in her chest. It wasn't quite satisfaction. The damage he'd caused couldn't be undone by a verdict, but it was closure, the knowledge that he would face consequences for his actions. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, shouting questions. Wyatt pushed through the crowd, keeping Grace close, but before they could reach their wagon, Emma Thornton appeared. "Miss Whitmore, may I speak with you?" Grace nodded, and they stepped away from the crowd. Emma's eyes were red from crying. "Thank you for being brave enough to fight him. I don't know if I could have come forward if you hadn't shown the way." "You were brave, too. Braver than me, probably. You had nothing to gain from testifying." "I had my dignity to reclaim, same as you." Emma managed a small smile. "What will you do now?" "Go home, marry a good man, try to build a life that doesn't revolve around past trauma." "That sounds nice." Emma glanced back at the courthouse. "I think I might go out west, California maybe. Start completely fresh where no one knows my story." Grace impulsively hugged the younger woman. "Wherever you go, I hope you find peace." "You too." The journey back to Broken Creek took 3 days. Grace spent much of it in contemplative silence, processing everything that had happened. The trial had been draining, forcing her to relive the worst moments of her life in front of strangers. But it was over now. Pierce was in prison. The truth was known. As they crested the final hill before the ranch came into view, Danny tugged on her sleeve. "Miss Grace, when we get home, can we plan the wedding?" Grace laughed, the first genuine laughter she'd felt in weeks. "Yes, sweetheart, we can plan the wedding." "I want to help. Mama used to say planning weddings was important." "Then you'll be my assistant. We'll plan it together." Wyatt reached over and took her hand. "Whatever you want, Grace. Big or small, fancy or simple. It's your day." "Our day," she corrected. "And I think I want simple. Just family and close friends. Nothing elaborate." "Simple works for me." The ranch looked beautiful in the late afternoon sun. The repairs were complete, the house standing solid and proud. Several ranch hands were working in the corral, and Rosa had clearly been baking because the scent of fresh bread wafted from the open kitchen windows. Home. This was home now. Not just a place she worked or a refuge from persecution, but genuinely home. Over the next few weeks, preparations for the wedding consumed the household. Rosa took charge of the food preparation, planning a feast that would feed everyone in Broken Creek. Danny helped Grace pick wildflowers from the meadow to decorate the house. Caleb and the ranch hands built a wooden arch for the ceremony, positioning it near the creek where the water ran clear and the trees provided shade. Reverend Cole came to the ranch to discuss the ceremony. He looked older, somehow worn down by guilt. "Miss Whitmore, before we discuss the wedding, I need to apologize properly. not just with words but with actions. I've begun preaching about the dangers of judgment and the importance of mercy. Several families have told me they've reconsidered how they treat outsiders and those accused of wrongdoing. That's good, Reverend. I'm glad something positive came from all this. I want you to know that you'll always be welcome in our church. And I hope you'll consider teaching Sunday school. We need someone who understands true Christian charity. Grace was surprised by the offer. I'll think about it after the wedding and things settle down. Of course. Now about the ceremony itself. They spent the next hour discussing vows and readings and music. Grace chose simple traditional vows. She wanted nothing fancy or showy, just honest promises made before God and witnesses. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in October, when the brutal heat of summer had finally broken and the air carried the first hints of autumn coolness. Grace woke that morning to find Rosa already in the kitchen cooking up a storm. The older woman's eyes were suspiciously red. "Are you crying, Rosa?" "No, something in my eye." Rosa wiped her face with her apron. "You look beautiful, mija." Grace wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that Rosa had made for her. It wasn't elaborate, but it fit perfectly and made her feel pretty in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She'd woven wildflowers into her hair, and Danny had insisted she wear his mother's locket, a small silver heart that Sarah had worn on her own wedding day. "Are you sure Wyatt won't mind?" Grace had asked when Danny presented it. "Mama would want you to have it. She'd like you. You're kind like she was." Now standing in front of the mirror in her room, Grace touched the locket and whispered a prayer to a woman she'd never met. "Thank you for raising such a good man and such a sweet boy. I'll take care of them. I promise." By noon, people began arriving, not just from Broken Creek, but from surrounding ranches and towns. Word of the wedding had spread, and many came out of curiosity wanting to see the woman who had stood up to Randall Pierce and won. Doc Harrison came with his wife. The telegraph operator brought his whole family, including young Timothy with his recording device. Marshal Brennan arrived with his deputies. Even some of the women who had thrown stones came bearing gifts and apologies. Grace greeted them all with grace, accepting their well wishes and their guilt in equal measure. She wouldn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but she also wouldn't let it poison her future. At 2:00 the ceremony began. Grace walked from the house to the creek, not with a father to give her away, but alone, choosing this new life of her own free will. Danny walked beside her, carrying the rings on a small pillow. Wyatt stood under the wooden arch wearing his best suit, his hair freshly trimmed, his eyes shining with emotion. Caleb stood next to him as best man. Rosa stood on Grace's side, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. Reverend Cole began the ceremony with a reading from Corinthians about love being patient and kind. Then he looked at Wyatt. "Do you, Wyatt Morgan, take Grace Whitmore to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and cherish in sickness and health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." Wyatt's voice was strong and clear. "And do you, Grace Whitmore, take Wyatt Morgan to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and cherish in sickness and health for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Grace looked at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one, who had seen her worth when the world saw only scandal, who had fought for her, defended her, and loved her despite every reason not to. "I do." They exchanged rings. Simple gold bands, nothing fancy, but they felt heavy with promise. "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Wyatt, you may kiss your bride." Wyatt cupped Grace's face gently in his work-roughened hands and kissed her. It was their first real kiss, and it was perfect, sweet and tender and full of promise. The crowd cheered. Danny jumped up and down shouting, "They're married! They're really married!" Someone started playing a fiddle. Food appeared on long tables. The celebration began. Grace danced with Wyatt, then with Danny, then with Caleb and Doc Harrison, and even Reverend Cole. She ate Rosa's cooking and cut the wedding cake and laughed until her sides hurt. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt completely, unreservedly happy. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Wyatt took her hand and led her away from the crowd. They walked to the top of the small hill overlooking the ranch, the same spot where Wyatt used to stand alone, remembering his dead wife and wondering if he'd ever feel whole again. "Happy?" he asked, pulling her close. "Happier than I ever thought possible. No regrets." Grace thought about the long journey that had brought her here, the scandal in San Antonio, the stones thrown in Broken Creek, the terror of Pierce's attacks, the exhaustion of the trial. It had all been horrible, traumatic, nearly unbearable. But it had also led her here, to this man, this child, this home, this life. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Everything I went through led me to you. How could I regret that?" Wyatt kissed her forehead. "I love you, Grace Morgan." "I love you too." They stood together on the hill watching their guests celebrate below, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, a ranch to run, a child to raise, a life to build together. But for now, in this moment, everything was perfect. The years that followed were not without hardship. Ranching was brutal work subject to the whims of weather and market prices. There were droughts that tested their resources and illnesses that swept through the cattle. There were conflicts with neighboring ranchers over water rights and grazing land. There were times when money was tight and the future uncertain. But Grace and Wyatt faced everything together. She learned to ride and rope and brand cattle. She kept the ranch's books, negotiated prices with buyers, and proved herself as capable a rancher as any man. The hands who had initially doubted her came to respect her judgment and skill. Danny thrived. With Grace's encouragement, he began attending school in town, making friends and excelling at his studies. He was particularly gifted in mathematics and science, showing an aptitude that surprised everyone. "He gets that from his mother," Wyatt told Grace one evening as they reviewed Danny's test scores. "Sarah was always good with numbers." Grace smiled. She'd long ago made peace with the fact that Sarah would always be part of their family. She wasn't trying to replace Danny's mother just to be a good mother in her own right. In the spring of 1876, Grace discovered she was pregnant. The news filled the household with joy. Rosa immediately began knitting baby clothes. Danny asked 1,000 questions about what it would be like to have a sibling. Wyatt walked around with a permanent smile. The pregnancy was difficult. Grace suffered from severe morning sickness that lasted well into the 4th month. The summer heat was oppressive, making her swell and ache. But she never complained. This baby was a gift, a symbol of the new life she'd built. Sarah Morgan, Jr. was born on a cool October evening 1 year and 2 days after Grace and Wyatt's wedding. The labor was long and painful, but Grace emerged on the other side with a healthy baby girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined expression. Danny was instantly smitten. He spent hours sitting by the cradle singing to his sister, showing her his wooden horse, telling her about the ranch and the horses and everything she'd need to know when she was old enough to walk. "I'm going to teach her everything," he told Grace seriously. "How to ride and rope and be brave. She's lucky to have such a good big brother." 2 years later, a son arrived. They named him Jonathan after Grace's father. Then another daughter, Elizabeth. The house that had once been so silent and sad now rang with children's laughter and the chaos of family life. Grace established a school on the ranch, teaching not just her own children, but the children of ranch hands and neighboring families. She ordered books from back east and taught reading, writing, mathematics, history, and science. Some of the older ranchers grumbled about girls being educated, but Grace was unmoved. An educated woman can manage a household, keep books, teach her children, and contribute to her community, she told anyone who objected. Why would you want anything less for your daughters? Gradually, the objections faded. Grace's students went on to become teachers themselves, business people, even a lawyer and a doctor. She took pride in each of them, knowing she had helped shape their futures. Wyatt expanded the ranch, buying additional land as it became available. He bred better cattle, improving the herd's genetics and increasing profits. He drilled wells to ensure reliable water even during droughts. He built better fencing and barns and living quarters for the hands. Morgan Valley Ranch became one of the most prosperous operations in 3 counties, known for quality cattle and fair dealing. Wyatt served 3 terms as county sheriff, bringing law and order to an often lawless territory. He was respected, even loved by most of the community. But it was Grace's reputation that perhaps grew the most. The woman who had arrived in Broken Creek, covered in dust and blood, carrying nothing but shame and determination, became a pillar of the community. She served on the school board, organized relief efforts during hard times, and advocated for better treatment of women and the poor. When people talked about Grace Morgan, they no longer mentioned scandal. They talked about her courage, her kindness, her unwavering principles. They talked about how she'd stood up to Pierce when others were too afraid, how she'd turned tragedy into triumph, how she'd proven that worth was earned through character, not granted by circumstance. 10 years after the wedding, on a warm spring evening, Grace and Wyatt sat on their porch while their children played in the yard. Danny was 17 now, tall and strong, already talking about attending university to study medicine. Sarah was 9, a spitfire who could outride most of the ranch hands. Jonathan was 7, quiet and thoughtful like his father. Elizabeth was 5, always laughing, impossible not to love. "Do you ever think about Pierce?" Wyatt asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Grace considered the question. She'd heard through various sources that Pierce had been released from prison after 12 years for good behavior. He'd moved to California, where he lived quietly under a different name, broken by his time in prison and the complete destruction of his reputation. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I wonder if he ever understood why what he did was wrong, or if he just resented getting caught. Does it matter? I suppose not. He can't hurt anyone now. That's what matters." Wyatt took her hand. "Do you ever regret staying fighting instead of running?" Grace looked at her children at the ranch spread out before them, at the life they'd built together. She thought about the alternative, running again, always looking over her shoulder, never finding home. "No," she said firmly. "I regret nothing. Everything I went through brought me here, to you, to them, to this life. How could I regret that? Even the hard parts, the stones and the fear and Pierce, even those, they taught me who I am. They taught me that I'm stronger than I knew, that standing up for what's right is worth any cost." She squeezed his hand. "And they brought me to you." They sat in silence, watching the sun set over land they'd fought for and earned. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The children would grow and leave to make their own lives. The ranch would face new obstacles. They would grow old, face losses, weather storms, both literal and metaphorical. But they would face it all together. Partners in every sense. 2 people who had found each other in darkness and chosen to walk toward the light. 20 years after Grace first arrived in Broken Creek, the town threw a celebration in her honor. It was her 50th birthday, and the community wanted to recognize her contributions. A new school was being dedicated, built with donations from families whose children Grace had taught. They were naming it the Grace Morgan School for Girls and Boys. Grace stood on the platform looking out at the crowd and felt overwhelmed. These were people who had once thrown stones at her, who had wanted her driven away or dead. Now they were celebrating her, honoring her, claiming her as their own. Reverend Cole, now white-haired and frail, spoke first. "Grace Morgan came to us as a stranger carrying nothing but accusations and shame. We judged her without knowing her truth. We condemned her without offering mercy. We were wrong." He paused, his voice thick with emotion. "But Grace didn't let our judgment destroy her. She didn't become bitter or vengeful. Instead, she showed us what true Christian charity looks like. She taught our children. She helped our sick. She stood for justice when it was dangerous and costly. She taught us that worth is not determined by circumstances or rumors, but by character and actions." There were murmurs of agreement throughout the crowd. Doc Harrison spoke next, talking about Grace's medical knowledge and how she'd helped deliver dozens of babies over the years, saving lives through her skill and calm demeanor. Then Danny stepped forward. He was 27 now, a doctor who had returned to Broken Creek after completing his training in Boston. He looked so much like Wyatt, but he had Grace's compassion and wisdom. "Many of you remember me as the silent boy. Danny began. "The child who stopped speaking after my mother died. I was lost in grief, unable to find my way back to the world of the living." He looked at Grace, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Grace brought me back, not through force or frustration, but through patience and love. She sat with me in my silence. She told me stories. She never gave up on me even when doctors said I might never speak again." His voice grew stronger. "But she didn't just save me. She saved my father, who was drowning in his own grief. She saved our ranch, which was dying from neglect. She saved this entire community by showing us what real courage looks like. Not the courage of violence or domination, but the courage of persistence and kindness in the face of cruelty." Danny pulled out a small wooden horse, the same one Sarah had carved so many years ago. "My mother made this for me. I've carried it every day of my life since she died. It reminds me of her love. But it also reminds me that love doesn't end with death, that we can love again differently but just as deeply. Grace didn't replace my mother. She gave me a different kind of love, one that saved my life and shaped who I became." He turned to Grace. "Thank you, Mama Grace, for everything." Grace was crying now, unable to hold back tears. She stepped forward and pulled Danny into a tight hug while the crowd applauded. When it was finally her turn to speak, Grace looked out at all the faces. Some she recognized from that first terrible day in the street. Others were newer arrivals, people who only knew her current reputation, not her painful past. "I didn't come to Broken Creek seeking glory or recognition," she began. "I came here desperate and alone with nothing but the clothes on my back and the determination to survive. What I found here changed my life." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "Yes, some of you treated me cruelly at first. You believed lies because they confirmed your biases. You threw stones and harsh words and made my life almost unbearable." Several people in the crowd looked ashamed. "But you also gave me something precious. You gave me a chance to prove my worth. You gave me the opportunity to show that character matters more than circumstances, and eventually, most of you gave me your acceptance and your friendship." Grace looked at Wyatt standing off to the side with their children. "I found love here, a partner who saw my value when others saw only scandal. A family that I never dared hope I'd have. A community that, despite its flaws, eventually chose justice over prejudice." Her voice grew stronger. "But more than that, I found purpose. Teaching children, helping neighbors, standing up for those who can't stand up for themselves. These are the things that give life meaning." She gestured to the new school building. "This school represents hope. Hope that we can learn from our mistakes. Hope that we can teach our children to be better than we were. Hope that no child will ever be judged for circumstances beyond their control." Grace smiled through her tears. "Thank you for this honor. But more importantly, thank you for proving that people can change, that communities can grow, that redemption is possible for all of us if we're willing to do the hard work of becoming better." The celebration continued late into the evening. There was food and music and dancing. Children ran wild while adults caught up on gossip and news. It was the kind of community event that makes small towns special, where everyone knows everyone and shared history binds people together. As the evening wound down and people began heading home, Grace found herself alone for a moment, looking up at the stars. The Texas sky was vast and clear, the Milky Way visible as a river of light across the darkness. "Beautiful night." Wyatt appeared beside her, handing her a cup of coffee. "Perfect night," Grace agreed. "Hard to believe it's been 20 years since you showed up covered in dust and blood, refusing to beg. Hard to believe you took a chance on a stranger everyone else had condemned. Best decision I ever made." Wyatt pulled her close. "Though I'll admit that first week I wondered if I'd made a terrible mistake." Grace laughed. "Only the first week, maybe the first month, but once Danny started talking again I knew. You were exactly what this family needed." They stood together in comfortable silence, a silence earned through 2 decades of partnership, of facing challenges together, of building a life worth living. "Do you think Pierce ever understood?" Grace asked suddenly. "Why what he did was wrong?" Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Probably not. Men like Pierce never really understand. They see the world as something that exists to serve them. When it doesn't, they can't comprehend why. I used to hate him so much it consumed me. And now I pity him. He had everything: wealth, status, opportunity. And he threw it all away because he couldn't accept being told no. What a waste. That's very gracious of you. Grace shook her head. It's not grace. It's self-preservation. Holding on to hate would have destroyed me more surely than any of his attacks. Letting it go freed me. When did you let it go? The day Sarah was born. I was holding her, looking at her perfect little face, and I realized I didn't want to teach her hatred. I didn't want her to grow up in a house where anger and resentment lived. So I chose to release it. Wyatt kissed her temple. You're a remarkable woman, Grace Morgan. I'm an ordinary woman who survived extraordinary circumstances, that's all. No, you're extraordinary. And I'm grateful every day that you walked into my life. They stayed on the porch long after everyone else had gone home, talking about their children's futures, about plans for the ranch, about growing old together. Simple conversations about simple things. The conversations of two people who have built a life together and find contentment in it. 27 years after arriving in Broken Creek, Grace Morgan stood in the same place where she'd been stoned. But now she stood as the guest of honor at the town's 50th anniversary celebration. She was 63 years old, her hair gray, but her posture still straight, her eyes still sharp. The mayor presented her with a plaque, recognizing her as one of the founding mothers of modern Broken Creek. Photographers from newspapers in Austin and San Antonio took pictures. Young women who had been her students introduced their own children to Miss Grace. But the moment Grace treasured most came later when a young woman approached her nervously. She was perhaps 20, wearing a simple dress holding a baby. Mrs. Morgan, you don't know me, but I know your story. I came to Broken Creek last year after something bad happened. Something similar to what happened to you. People said terrible things. I wanted to die. Grace took the young woman's hand. But you didn't. No, because people told me about you, about how you survived, about how you turned suffering into strength. You gave me hope that I could survive too. Tears rolled down Grace's cheeks. What's your name? Lily. Lily Patterson. Well, Lily Patterson, you are so much braver than you know. You survived. You kept going. You built a life. Grace looked at the baby. And you created new life. That's not just survival. That's triumph. I named her Grace, after you. Grace gathered both Lily and baby Grace into her arms, holding them while they both cried. This was why she'd stayed, why she'd fought, not for recognition or honor or even vindication, but for moments like this, for the chance to be a light for someone else stumbling in darkness. Wyatt found them there, 3 generations of women bound by shared experience and the refusal to let cruelty win. He didn't interrupt, just stood nearby, ready if needed, but respecting the moment. When Lily finally left, promising to bring the baby to visit the ranch, Grace turned to her husband. I'm tired, she admitted. Let's go home. Home. Such a simple word, but it meant everything. It meant the ranch where they'd raised 4 children. It meant the bedroom they'd shared for nearly 3 decades. It meant the kitchen where Rosa still cooked, though she was now in her 80s and had a young woman to help her. It meant the porch where they sat every evening watching the sun set. It meant safety, belonging, love. That night, Grace and Wyatt lay in bed, the window open to let in the cool evening breeze. They were both too old and tired for the passionate lovemaking of their youth, but they held each other with a tenderness that passion could never match. I want you to promise me something, Grace said into the darkness. Anything. When I die, don't let anyone rewrite my story. Don't let them forget the stones and the scandal. Don't let them pretend I was always accepted and loved. Why would you want people to remember the hard parts? Because the hard parts matter. They're what makes the triumph meaningful. If people forget how I was treated, they might forget why it was wrong. They might forget to treat the next desperate woman with kindness instead of cruelty. Wyatt tightened his arms around her. "I promise. Your true story will be told. All of it." "Thank you." They drifted toward sleep, two old people who had weathered life's storms and emerged on the other side with their love intact and their principles uncompromised. Grace's last thought before sleep claimed her was gratitude. Gratitude for the long, improbable journey that had led her here. Gratitude for the man who had seen her worth when others saw only scandal. Gratitude for the children who had filled her life with purpose. Gratitude for the community that had eventually chosen to be better. Gratitude for dignity found in the dust of a Texas street and for the life that had bloomed from that unlikely seed. Grace Morgan lived another 20 years, passing away peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83. Wyatt followed her 2 years later, unable to live long without his other half. They were buried side by side on the ranch under an oak tree near the creek. Danny, by then a renowned doctor and teacher, ensured their story was preserved. He wrote a memoir about his mother Sarah and about Grace, the woman who had saved him and his father. The book became a bestseller, inspiring countless readers with its message of hope and resilience. The Grace Morgan School continued to educate children for another 100 years, its mission statement emphasizing that worth is earned through character, not granted by circumstances. Scholarships were established for students facing adversity, ensuring that no child would be denied education because of poverty or scandal. Morgan Valley Ranch remained in the family for 5 generations, each one adding to the legacy Grace and Wyatt had built. The house was eventually designated a historical landmark, and tours were given to teach new generations about the woman who had stood up to cruelty and won. In Broken Creek's town square, a statue was erected. It showed a woman standing tall, shoulders back, chin up, facing forward with determination. The plaque read, "Grace Whitmore Morgan, 1851 to 1934. Teacher, mother pioneer." She was judged by her circumstances, but proved herself by her character. She was brought down by cruelty, but rose through dignity. She taught us that worth is earned, not given, and that the measure of a person is found in how they treat those who cannot defend themselves. May we always remember her courage and strive to be worthy of her example. Every year on the anniversary of the day Grace first arrived in Broken Creek, the town held a celebration called Dignity Day. It was a day of service and compassion when people volunteered at shelters, helped those in need, and committed to treating strangers with kindness instead of judgment. Because Grace Morgan had taught them an invaluable lesson, one that echoed through generations, that every person deserves dignity regardless of their circumstances. That rushing to judgment makes us smaller, while offering compassion makes us greater. That standing up for what's right, even when it's costly and difficult, is always worthwhile. And that sometimes the people we're quickest to condemn are the ones who will teach us the most about courage, grace, and the true meaning of strength. Her story became legend, but it started as all great stories do, with one choice. The choice to stand instead of run. To fight instead of surrender, to believe in her own worth even when the world said she had none. Grace Whitmore Morgan, a woman who arrived in Broken Creek carrying nothing but scandal and determination, and left a legacy of love, justice, and unwavering dignity that would inspire generations to come.